Okay. So far we've been looking at purpose for education, specifically purpose for teaching. What is our purpose in teaching? What purpose do we have in doing teaching? And we have said that our purpose for teaching is to see our students experience transformation, moving from where they are to where we want them to be. We do not want our students to remain where they are, and that transformation has to do with the cognitive aspect, the affective, and the psychomotor. So it has to be holistic. So we want to see in teaching, our intent, our desire is to see our students experience transformation. It's not necessarily, we've said, it is not a transmission of information, but it is the transformation of our students. And then we've looked at teaching and learning, and we try to define and try to understand what is teaching and what is learning. I would like to encourage you to go back and look at what we meant by teaching, what we meant by learning. We have said the root word for teaching comes from the idea of learning. So when we're talking about teaching, we cannot talk about it separate from learning. So teaching has to do with causing our students to learn. It is designing our environment, designing our education in such a way that it will cause our students to learn. If our students are not learning, we have not been teaching. Okay, so we've been talking about all of these things. I hope you've been able to reflect on what you understand by teaching, and you were able to reflect on what you understand by learning. Now, learning theories. Different people have understood what learning is and how learning happens in different ways, and therefore many different kinds of learning theories have been proposed. And in this section, we'll be looking at different learning theories. My intent for this, not necessarily for this session, but in talking about learning theories generally, is that you will be able to describe the three theories of learning that we'll be presenting in this lesson. So there are three different theories that we'll be looking at, but then let's begin by looking at what we mean by a learning theory. These are conceptual frameworks describing how information is absorbed, how it is processed, and how it is retained. Now, we need to know everything that you and I do is determined and it is driven by some kind of a belief system that we have, okay? And that belief system, that philosophy drives the way we do education, drives the way we do our teaching. So we need to be able to understand. We need to understand, what is it that I believe? What do I believe in terms of how teaching occurs? And as we evaluate that, we will be able to shape the way we actually do our teaching. If we don't understand the way we are teaching and what is driving it, then we'll continue to be doing the way we do it. Usually, we teach by the way other people have taught, by the way we have seen other people teach, by the way you and I have been taught itself. And that is not necessarily always the best way. There are some wonderful teachers that we remember and we look up to, but there are also others who have been not so great teachers. So we need to see which ones have shaped the way we are teaching. So we need to understand the different learning theories. So learning theory is developed based on an understanding of what we believe. How do people receive that information? How do they process that information? How do they retain it? And how do they retrieve it? On the basis of that, we have those three different schools of thought. The first one is the behavioral theory of learning. Second one is cognitive theory of learning. And the third one is humanistic theory of learning. You will find different classifications of this. There are many more theories of this. Some of them are subsets of these ones. Each one of those ones are divided into broad spectrum of theories. So, but for this one, for this presentation, we can only touch on these ones and we can't go into details, but I encourage you to look at many other possible theories if you're interested. So we'll be looking at these three. To start with, in this video, we'll be looking at the behavioral theory of learning. Now, the emphasis in the behavioral learning of theory of learning, as it shows, as the name itself shows, it has to do with observable and measurable behaviors. So they are saying learning is based on what can be observed and what can be measured. For me to be able to see that somebody has learned, I should be able to see the person's behavior, and I should be able to measure it. And also the way we cause that person to learn is also related with the physical, the outward manipulation of it. Prominent theorists here include Ivan Pavlov. This is the classical conditioning. Pavlov, this is a guy that you guys, all of us know from early on. E.L. Thorndike is the second one, and then we have B.F. Skinner, these three. And then we'll be looking at Watson, and I have given you a video for you to be watching about Watson. Watson will be someone like a father for the behavioral theory. Okay, so beginning to start with, let's start with Pavlov here. So Pavlov, we know this guy. If we were in a class, I would ask you to explain to me, and most of you, a number of you, would probably explain to me who Pavlov is and what he has done. So he's the guy who has done an experiment with a dog. So what he did is, you know, when you give someone food or show food, that dog begins to salivate, okay? Salivates. We have a dog here at home, and I hold food, and it will be looking, and you can see it swallowing its saliva. So in a classroom, I begin to talk about meat and herbs, and when I talk about herbs, I can see some of the students going, I'm already doing that for myself as well, even now. But that's what it is. When you show food to the dog, it salivates. That's natural, normal. So we have food here, and it is presented to the dog, and the dog will salivate. The food has that potential to cause the dog to salivate naturally, and therefore it's called an unconditioned stimulus. And when the dog sees food, naturally it will be salivating, so that response to this stimulus is called an unconditioned response, because it is a natural response. But then when the bell is rung together with the food, and that is causing the dog to salivate, the bell is called a conditioned stimulus, because the bell should not cause the dog to salivate naturally. If I show you a bell, it should not cause you to salivate. Okay, naturally it doesn't have the capacity to do that. Therefore, that thing, the stimulus as a bell, it is conditioned. When it is rung at the time the food is provided for the dog and the dog is salivating, this is unconditioned stimulus. So with repetition, as you keep doing it to the dog, what happens is when you ring the bell, the dog learns. With the bell, there comes what? With the bell, there comes food. And therefore, as soon as you ring the bell, hearing the bell ring, the dog begins to salivate. Now what happened is the bell has become a conditioned stimulus. It is doing what it should naturally not be able to do. It should not cause the dog to salivate. But because of its association to food over time, it has been conditioned, it has been made to cause the dog to salivate. So the salivation of the dog, it's not salvation, it is the salivation of the dog to a conditioned stimulus is called a conditioned response, because that should not happen naturally. The dog should not salivate naturally for the ringing of the bell. So this was the experiment that he did. Now the findings showed that the repeated presentation of the conditioned stimulus, that is the bell, with an unconditioned stimulus, that's the food, resulted in a gradual increase in conditioned response. Hence, the conditioning process was seen as an explanation for the development of human behavior, meaning you can cause a person to behave in a way that you want using this process. You can make a person to behave in the way you want. They will say, however you want him to behave, you can make him behave in that way using this process. He believed that most environmental stimuli could become conditioned stimuli with direct effects on behavior. So he will say most of the things that you have in the environment, you can make them to be conditioned stimuli so that they will cause the kind of behavior that you want your students to have. For example, let me pick up a pen here, okay? Let's say this is a pen, okay? So this pen, if I show you this pen, how would you feel about it? I don't think you will feel anything about this, okay? Because it's just a pen. But then imagine if I use this pen for some other purpose, okay? If I use this pen to, you remember this thing, right? Okay, you remember this. When we were in school, the teachers used to do this. So if I begin to use this pen for that purpose, how would you feel the minute I bring out the pen? Now, this has become conditioned. Earlier, it was not conditioned. When you see this pen, you have no feeling, no fear or anything. But now, because I started using this as a way of punishment to make you behave in a way that I want, the minute I bring out the pen, you start to behave. So this becomes a behavior. This becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the behavior that you will be behaving, that I'm making you to behave by, as a result of this pen, will become a conditioned response. So they're basically saying you can use anything in your environment to shape and modify the behavior of a person. Now, with this kind of, with this theory, it is, you have to repeat this over time. As it is repeated, then that behavior becomes conditioned. That person begins to behave in the way you want. But then when you stop this, when you withdraw the use of this, over time, that behavior also begins to diminish and eventually to disappear. So that kind of behavior is not a permanent one. It exists as long as this stimulus exists there. Now, the second one is the trial and error, and this is the person, E.L. Thorndike, who comes up with this one. E.L. Thorndike, it's called a trial and error one. Now, what happens is you have a cat here. So you put a cat into a box. She's closed in there. Now, obviously a cat, she wants to go out. So she tries different things. And through trial and error, accidentally she touches this one here, this lever. When she touches that, then she sees that the door opens. And when the door opens and comes out, she finds a reward here. She finds food here. Okay? So now again, you put her back inside. And again, over time, she touches that thing. She comes out. She finds food, reward. You put her back in. She does that. She opens eventually. Now, as she repeats this, she begins to see that touching this lever, this thing here, pulling it down, will open the door and there will be her reward outside. So driven by this reward that comes after a certain behavior, begins to stick in her head, begins to stick there. And so not necessarily her head, but she begins to know when she pulls this, when she behaves in this way, there will be a reward. Okay? How did she find that? How did she find that? It's not because she thought about it. If I pull that one, maybe the door will open and then maybe I'll be able to find food. No. It was by trial and error, and that trial and error behavior resulted in some kind of a reward. And through that repetition of that behavior and the reward connected, okay, this is also called connectionism, because she connects the behavior to the reward, and therefore when she pulls that, she knows there will be food outside. So that is this behavior. So Thorndike, he came up with 3 laws. He comes up with 3 very important laws, which I kind of like. The first one is what's called the law of effect. Any response followed by pleasure or reward is strengthened, and any response followed by pain is weakened. So I behave in a certain way, I get some kind of reward. Oh, I would say there's a reward if I behave this way, so I get to learn that. So I behave, I receive reward, I behave, I receive reward, and what happens is that behavior will be strengthened. If my child is not behaving in a way I want, and if it is followed with some kind of pain, then that behavior will be weakened. So whatever is strengthened, when you strengthen a behavior, it could even be with simple words like, well done, that's beautiful, you've done an excellent job, I appreciate you. You know, those kind of words by themselves, they can strengthen the behavior. Second one is the law of readiness. This one is saying you can't assume every student that's in your classroom is interested, excited to be in your classroom. No. The students that are in your classroom may not be interested in what you're teaching. Maybe if you're teaching even Sunday school, some of the kids may have been dragged into your Sunday school class. They don't want to be there, but the mama has brought them into the classroom. Now that the child is in your classroom, you have the responsibility of gaining that student's attention and being able to teach that student. And therefore, you need to have this. That's where the law of readiness comes. A student needs to be made ready in order for that student to be able to receive what you have to offer. Okay, so that's what we are saying, what he is saying here. When you begin to teach about something, make sure that you gain the readiness, the preparedness of the student, showing that student the significance of what you're teaching or different ways of doing it. Finally, the third law he comes up is the law of exercise. This is the idea of repetition. As that behavior is repeated, you get your students to repeat the behavior in different ways, then that behavior is most likely to stick and remain with the student. Okay? Then we have the B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner, what he basically did is he built on what Thorndike has done. Okay? Skinner, he's regarded as the father of operant conditioning, but his work was based on Thorndike's law of effect. Law of effect says whatever you reward will be strengthened, whatever is results in pain is weakened. So he comes up with a new terminology here, and he calls it reinforcement. Whatever is reinforced, that behavior will be strengthened. Okay, whatever is not reinforced, that behavior will be weakened, is what he comes up with. So he coined this term, operant conditioning, and it means roughly changing the behavior by the use of reinforcement. So this is basically what I said earlier. So a behavior that is reinforced is strengthened, and a behavior that is not reinforced, it will be weakened. Excuse me. Okay, reinforcement is the process of increasing the frequency of occurrence of a low frequency behavior. ምን ማለት ነው? በቃ ብዙ የማይደረግ ቢሄቪየር ከሆነ ያ ቢሄቪየር ልጁ የማያደርገው ከሆነ ግን እንዲያደርገው የምንፈልግ ከሆነ ምን እናደርጋለን? ሪኢንፎርስ እናደርገዋለን። ኦኬ ሶ ሎው ኦከረንስ ወይም ደግሞ ቢሄቪየሩ አለ የሚያጠና ጎበዝ ተማሪ የሚጸልይ ቃል የሚያነብ ሰው ከሆነ ያንን ቢሄቪየሩን እንዲቀጥል የምንፈልግ ከሆነ ምን እናደርጋለን? we reinforce it in different ways. Positive reinforcement occurs when a stimulus is presented, which when added to the situation increases the probability. So positive reinforcement aለ, negative reinforcement aለ. Positive reinforcement is when you give something, you add something good that the student wants, the learners want. Okay, when you add something that they want. Negative reinforcement is when you remove something that they don't want. Okay, so negative reinforcement has to do with removing unpleasant stimulus. ለምሳሌ final exam or quizzes. Our students sometimes they don't like quizzes. So if you see that the students have been performing very well, studying well, submitting their papers well, then you can say, you know what, you guys have been doing excellent, very good job with the studies. Keep doing that, and I'll remove the quizzes. that would encourage them to keep doing whatever they have been doing. So positive reinforcement has to do with giving them something that they want, something pleasant. Negative reinforcement is removing something that is unpleasant. Okay. The most significant stimulus for the learner will be that which immediately follows the response. Okay. The stimulus has to be done immediately for it to be effective. ቆይቶ የሚደረግ ነገር ሳይሆን ልክ ተማሪው እንዳደረገ ወዲያውኑ የሚሰጥ ሲሆን it becomes more effective. All right. So I hope you're doing good so far. So we'll be looking at the critiques for behaviorism, and then we'll finish this session for that one. Some critiques about behaviorism. There are some good things about behaviorism. Okay, there are things that we learn. There are things that we use. This kind of technique is used with many children, but especially with children with autism, that kind of mental issues. In a classroom, in educational setting, we use it. We do it. Imagine it. Okay, let me just read here for a minute. It does not account for processes taking place in the mind. Okay, that cannot be observed. So for behaviorists, they're focused on what we can be observing, what we can see. But the mental process, the fact that us as humans, we think, we process certain things before we act, that doesn't fit with their theory. Advocates for passive student learning, their assumption, the teacher is the one who's doing everything, the student passively becomes what the teacher wants him to be. So this is allowing for passive engagement of the student, passive. One size fits all, whatever I do with this child would work with that child, is the assumption. So it removes the uniqueness of each child, and therefore that's a negative part of it. Most of the studies are done on animals, dogs or the more rats. The point is, you can't generalize studies that is done on animals to humans, but because I believe we are different from the animals.